Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Mubarak out. This is the Egyptian revolution has succeeded in ousting Mubarak, and it came hard on the heels of the Tunisian revolution that ousted the dictator Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali. Our Vice President, Joe Biden, didn't want to say that Mubarak was a dictator, which shows the vacillation of U.S. foreign policy regarding events in Egypt and the revolution in the Arab world that's taking place not only in Tunisia and Cairo, Egypt, but also in other places in the Arab world. If we look at all the places that have rejected this kind of colonialism and imperialism, we find that it is Lebanon, it is Yemen, it is Iraq, it is Palestine, and so forth. So this is a new dawn in the Arab world. The Arab world and the masses that have been despised by their own rulers, example, Hosni Mubarak talking with disrespect and with disregard to his own population, his own masses. But now the masses have spoken and the revolution has conquered that which the Americans and the Mubarak regime didn't think could be conquered, but it had. So to discuss this, we have Dr. Fikry Andrawes. Thank you, Doctor, for coming over. Dr. Andrawes is a Ph.D. in chemistry, but he is also a political writer and activist, and he follows closely events in the Arab world and especially in his own home, old country, which is Egypt. And Dr. Andrawes was planning on leaving for Egypt on Tuesday, the 15th, hoping to take part in getting rid of the dictator Mubarak. But now he's going to be going still on Tuesday to witness and be part of the second stage of the revolution, which is trying to maintain the gains of the revolution and make sure that these gains would be achieved without being contained or co-opted by external powers or by certain elites in Egypt that wish that things remain the same as they were like 18 days, 19 days ago. So thank you, Fikry, for coming over. And I just want you to say something about your own work first in terms of political activity, etc. And I want to note that one of your writings was a book in Arabic about Muslims and Copts through history. And this is obviously in Egypt. And I just want to show the book and ask you to comment on your writings and also on your understanding of what is happening and what this book is talking about.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I came to the United States almost 40 years ago, and in the last few years, there was some sectarian tension in Egypt. And that got me interested in trying to find the roots of this. So I studied Egyptian history, and I found to my surprise, that whenever there is a tension between Christian and Muslim, there is always a weak government. Historically, I'm talking about 1500 years. There is no exception. And I think in this book, I documented this very well. Mm-hmm. This is the reason for writing this book.
So what is the relationship, say, between this book and what's happened in Egypt and what's still happening in Egypt at this point?
I think the sectarian tension accelerated really in the last probably 10 years or so. And I believe the government played a role in that. For instance, we know now that there was an explosion in a church New Year Eve. And I believe that this was of the government work, because for the period before that, there was lots of talk about how the election was really poorly managed, and it was really forged all through. The party of Mubarak got 95% of the seats in the parliament, which is absurd. Everyone would realize that, even if you may allow me, even if God is running for an office today, he wouldn't get 95%. The reason that the Mubarak government did that, because he wanted his son to really inherit the presidency in Egypt. So they initiated this, so people talk about the Copts-Muslim relation and what's happening, and they accuse Al-Qaeda for that, which they haven't really proved or haven't shown any evidence for that at all. I believe this is also just showed that whenever there is a weak government, there is always a problem with minorities, independent of who the minorities are. It could be Christian, it could be Muslim, it could be Jews, it could be Hindus. This is something that also I think people have to be very careful about, because we have example in the history. I think what happened to the Jews in Europe, for instance, is a good example for that.
Yeah. So in terms of your observation of the situation in Egypt as it is unfolding, so what is your opinion about the demands that were put by the youth, and what is the relationship between what happened in Egypt and the political parties that, the traditional political parties in Egypt, that the political parties were unable to do what the youth has done so far. So could you say something about that in terms of your observations?
Well, realistically, really, there wasn't any political party in Egypt other than the government party, because there was no democracy. So in a political climate, where there is no democracy, you give rise to fundamentalism. That's why we have rise in Muslim fundamentalism. The government of Egypt, in my opinion, and I think lots of Egyptians know that for years, that the government game was either we, the government, as moderate, or you have the Muslim Brotherhood, which they are radical Muslim, which is really, it just wasn't fair, because the government policy was always to overplay some of the things that some radical Muslims were doing. We know that if you don't have democracy, you have rise to fundamentalism. And we know this through the history of Egypt. If you look, for instance, at the government of Egypt before 1952, the Muslim fundamentalists were really very poor, and they didn't really even were able to formulate a political party. Kill democracy, have poor education, and you will have radicalism. And you see this in Pakistan, you see this in Afghanistan. Democracy is a way to kill political Islam.
The lack of democracy. Democracy is the way to. Absolutely.
And I think always that the Muslim Brotherhood power was overplayed.
Yes.
They have the right, I believe strongly, that they should have the right to form political party if they choose to do so. I disagree with their ideology, but the only way is that they should really try to get involved and in the process and play the game by the rule of the game. In this case, they have to moderate their radical views.
Yeah, and you're saying this while you are a Christian Copt.
Yes.
Yeah, you are a Copt. You're
course.
not Muslim.
Yes, I'm
and
not.
you say that. You say that.
You're right.
So
yeah.
that's very important.
Yeah.
We have a caller on the line, Noel Kent. You're on the air, Noel.
Oh, hello. was just wondering, Professor Aoude, why the U.S. has continued to support a dictator like Mubarak for 30 years. Why this obsession with stability when in fact the support of dictators always leads to instability and chaos, like we've seen over the past few weeks, and the people rebel. So
Yeah.
why have we been so committed to someone like Mubarak?
Yeah, because, I just want to say, I'll have Fikry also talk about this, but I just want to say, like, the ludicrous thing that Mubarak, before he stepped down, was saying, which was, I want to leave, but if I leave, there will be chaos in Egypt. So what was happening on the streets of Egypt, and who was responsible for the chaos? His people, his own security forces, were shooting at the revolutionaries and the demonstrators. So anyway, the thing is that what's happening is was really ridiculous of what Mubarak was saying. But I would ask like Fikry also to talk about this. So why 30 years of Mubarak and the U.S. supporting it for stability?
Well, I would like to make really a distinction between the American people and the American government. The American people are very kind people, and they always like to support some of the things that we stand for, like freedom of speech and democracy and human rights and all these things. The government of the United States really was different. The government of the United States based its policy on their financial interest, which is, it doesn't matter who is in power. If there is a dictator that supports our policy, he is fine. We have example of that, for instance, in Iraq. If you look at Saddam Hussein was one of our men in the Middle East, and we supported him financially and militarily. And then when his policy started to contradict or become difficult for the United States to digest, we got rid of him. We supported Mubarak for the same reason. Mubarak was a dictator for 30 years. The United States knows that very well. But I have to say really a couple of things. I think the American media, especially, for instance, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, PBS, did a remarkable job in covering what happens in Egypt. And I think they were very honest, they were very professional in doing that, which I think this helped Americans to really understand what was going on. And I also admire what the American administration did, which is they really have a choice, either to support this regime or to be on the right side of the history, which I believe that in this incident, Obama did that. And I hope they will continue to do that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now what I want to do is I interviewed Professor Faridi Farhi, adjunct professor of political science here at the UH. And I asked her about some of the realities in the Middle East, and we'll watch that and then we can comment on it. Mm-hmm. So we'll watch that.
The reality in the Middle East has been that various governments in the region have not been very sensitive to domestic or popular sentiments, and therefore changes will have serious consequences. And not only it will impact Egypt, but because Egypt is at the center of the Middle East, it will also impact other countries in the region, precisely because Egypt is such a bellwether. So you see already reactions, for example, in Jordan, where the King of Jordan has dismissed the government, and today he has ordered the new government to begin talking with the opposition Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. You already even see reaction to it in places like Syria. Yemen is the same thing. The president of Yemen has already said that he will not run again and has allowed for more protests. The impact in terms of sort of democratic contagion will not be the same in the Persian Gulf states because they are well off, and therefore they can increase their social services and funding to the population. And the reality is that so much of what is happening in countries like Egypt or Tunisia is in effect aside from the democratic component of it, part and parcel of the increased immiseration of a large part of the population because of the economic policies that have been pursued throughout the globe. We saw different manifestations of it in countries as varied as Egypt, for example, or even in France, for example. So the countries that are more vulnerable in terms of those economic issues, high unemployment, as well as the inability to find satisfactory employment, is definitely part and parcel of this process.
Yeah, so she's talking about general things happening in the Middle East, but also I'm thinking about implications to other areas. I mean, she talked about Yemen and Syria and this and that, but there's implications in terms of especially the Palestinian situation with what happened in Egypt right now, Mubarak out and the rest of it. What might that do to the Israeli-Arab conflict on the one hand, and especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? So I think this is a critical thing for that. But maybe before we talk about this, I would like to go to another segment of Faridi, because we're talking, I asked her about American foreign policy. So we have a larger picture of that, and then we can discuss.
Because American foreign policy has been precisely based on this division between the government and popular sentiments. The basis of the support United States government has given to all these very authoritarian, corrupt governments has been precisely based on this lack of respect or not taking into account those popular sentiments. Of course, they have argued that these governments have to be authoritarian because if the Arabs are not controlled by a very strong hand, they are the type of people that will not be able to survive. There'll be chaos, or they have Islamic sentiment. So an Islamic sentiment immediately means radicalism and fundamentalism and terrorism. So by making those kind of linkages, they have given justification for their support of these very authoritarian and corrupt governments. And that edifice is about to fall down in a very, very drastic manner. It used to be, most of the people who studied the Middle East always talked about this fact that American foreign policy in the region is not wise, that in the long run, the support that the United States gives these authoritarian governments because, for example, they have peace treaties with Israel, or because they can control terrorism and so on. These are the justifications. Ultimately, it's not wise, because in the long run, people will become fed up. You cannot push people around this way for a very long period of time. Well, the long run has just now turned into short run.
Yeah, so you mentioned Fikry, as we're going to discuss Farida's two segments. You also mentioned that in the beginning that U.S. Foreign policy doesn't matter. It goes according to its own interests, and doesn't matter for it whether it's a dictator or a democrat, you know, that they are dealing with, so long their interests are going through very well. So that's one thing. And then in terms of how as Farida was talking about U.S. Foreign policy and what are the dictates for that foreign policy. So could you say more about you know, what the U.S. has been doing recently, while being reminded of the fact that just before the revolution broke out in Egypt, Hillary Clinton, you know, said, "Oh, what's going to happen? What happened in Tunisia doesn't happen in Egypt because Egypt is stable." So, what do you say about all these
Or
things?
Biden saying that
Yeah.
Obama is
It's
not a dictator.
I mean, Mubarak is not a dictator.
I'm sorry, yeah. I don't know where to start. I really think, first of all, I think the peace treaty with Israel is a solid one. It's not going to change. Any government in Egypt is going to come, is going to honor this. I just want to talk a little bit about how corrupt these governments are, not only in Egypt and the rest of the area. For instance, now we know that Mubarak asset is about $70 billion. This is huge amount of money for a country that is poor. I just want to tell you something about the education in Egypt, because education in Egypt is really very important and is what's going to put Egyptian up or down. We spend on education per person 75 Egyptian pound per year.
Yeah.
The Israelis are paying 30 times more. So that gives you an idea why we have radicalism among people and why we have people accepting some Islamic principle very naively because they're not educated. And if Mubarak has $70 billion, how about the rest of the gang around him? So you're talking about really tremendous amount of resources that are stolen from the people, not really making money in an honest way. This also extends to the rest of the Arab world. I would like to add something about Israel, really. While I think that the treaty with Egypt will be honored by whatever government is going to come, I also think Israel has to really be reasonable in their policy. You can't just move people out of their homeland and get settlers from whatever with Jewish background and give them this land. The Palestinians have been suffering for almost a century now. And I'm sure there are lots of Jews in this country, as well as in Palestine, who are opposing to this from humanitarian point of view. I always thought of the Israelis government as a little evil empire, because they just have no regard for the humanity of the Palestinian people. If we're not going to have peace in the Middle East unless the Israelis really change their policy fundamentally. And I also think part of the problem that we have with the United States policy is that the United States has always sided with Israel no matter what. And you just look at the record in the UN, how many vetoes the United States used for the benefit of Israel. And Israel is about 4 or 5 millions. The Arab world now is about 200 millions. most people don't really know or don't want to know how Israel was formed. And there are now, you could read some of this written by a modern Israeli historian. So it is a record that's really known. I think people should take interest in knowing this.
Yeah. No, I think, in terms of the myth of creation of Israel versus the reality that like someone like Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli, was born in the geographic Palestine in the state of Israel. He wrote about it in a book 2006 called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Right.
So the creation myth of Israel is not really what happened. What happened was that the state of Israel was created by ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. I mean, these are based on archival materials from Israel, military archives and governmental
And there
archives.
are lots of new historians within Israel who writes about it, but these things are not known to the American public for some reason.
Yeah, for some reason we can guess what reason is that. So what I'm going to do now is in terms of talking more about the implications for the Arab world, and especially the Palestinian issue, which I'll get back to. I interviewed Professor Elton Daniel, professor of history at UH Manoa, and we talked about, I asked him about the implications for the Arab world, and he answered this. So we'll watch that and then we can discuss more.
Okay.
In terms of the implications for the Arab world in general, obviously one thing is how far this is going to spread. Tunisia's trouble in Algeria. Gaddafi was obviously worried, although there doesn't seem to be any disturbances there. Jordan has taken steps. Now I see apparently some kind of demonstrations are being organized in Syria. So I mean, this is quite a new phenomenon to have this kind of popular movement in so many places at once, and it's hard to know what it would portend. Hopefully it's going to lead to, many Arab states finally having governments that represent the wishes of their people. Whether that'll happen or not, I don't know. We'll have to see. For the U.S. And its imperial project, as you put it, I really don't see any scenarios that are likely to lead to good outcomes. If we take Egypt, for example, Mubarak must be feeling a lot like the last Shah of Iran. He said the Americans used him for all those years, and then when he wasn't expedient to have around anymore, they threw him out like a dead mouse. And I mean, the hints coming from Washington to Mubarak to leave have been pretty plain. He hasn't responded to them. He apparently isn't as wise as King Farouk to just get on his yacht and sail away.
In 3 days.
So, I mean, to me, let's say Mubarak manages to cling to power somehow. He's certainly not going to be too happy with the Obama administration for basically telling him to get lost. I don't see how the rosy relationship is going to continue after that. I don't see how Washington could support him if he brutally crushes the revolt. So if he stays in power, that looks pretty bad for relations. And if he goes, I can't imagine that the policies are going to stay the same in Egypt. And of course, that's a quandary for Washington. They would like to have a more pleasant face on the leadership, but they really don't want the policies to change.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because on the one hand, Israel was giving not only signals, but directly talking to the United States about the U.S. must guarantee the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Yeah, so that's one thing. And you mentioned that you don't think that any Egyptian government coming up would really do something to abrogate that treaty or something like that. So that is something that's worrisome. But we know what the Egyptian masses think of this peace agreement, yeah? And so that is still something worrisome, especially if everything is in flux. If I were Israel or the United States, I'd be worried about that, because on that basis, a whole kind of structure of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East is built. So that is very important. So maybe like we need to do some more discussion about that. I mean, what if the masses say we don't want that treaty? Because even with the treaty, as we know, the Egyptian masses did not normalize relation with with Israel.
Yes,
So
yes,
what's the relationship between them, the treaty and those kinds of other policies, not normalizing relation, or the practices of the masses in Egypt?
I believe the relation between the masses in the Arab world and peace treaty with whatever countries are doing it is cold. There's no doubt about it. And it is cold because of what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. The question is, are Arab willing to live with Jews or not? I tell you, I think just let's look at the history. They did very well. I give you a personal example. I was living in 3 stories building. One was taken by a Muslim, one was taken by a Jew, and one was taken by a Christian, my family. In front of our house, there was a synagogue. This was Egypt before the creation of Israel. The creation of Israel created problem to the Jews, not only in Egypt, in the rest of the world. What happened to the Jews in Europe was terrible. And certainly it was a collective punishment, which is what the Israelis have been practicing against the Palestinians before 1948 until today. The Israelis have to change their policy. They think because they have the military power that could allow them to wipe any country in the area. They have nuclear weapons, for instance. They have no regard for humans in the area completely. There is lots of problems with Iran because Iran is trying to, I don't know whether this is true or not, they're trying to build nuclear weapons. No one in the United States is talking about the fact that Israel has 200 nuclear heads. This is the hypocrisy that people see, people in the Middle East see. They are not stupid. They, in fact, their public knowledge and general information, I believe, is better than the average American person information.
Yeah.
And I think the American don't know that. And the media is responsible for that. The United States, you could get all the information you want, but you're not going to get it from the TV by just looking at a TV. You're not. You have to dig it out.
Yeah.
Or read a specific newspaper and a specific magazine.
Right.
Of course, there will be a sympathy with the Palestinians. The fate of the Arab-Israeli treatments, I think it has to be really reconsidered in the context of what is happening to the Palestinians. We're talking about roadmaps. We're talking about two-state solution. Anyone, you look at the map of, for instance, the West Bank and Gaza, and see the Israeli settlements in it, you see that this is an impossibility.
Yeah.
So it's the only solution that we could have is one-state solution, which is really what the PLO, when the PLO was strong and when the PLO was secular, before we give rise to Hamas, which, by the way, the Israelis were behind giving rise to Hamas in order to weaken the PLO said one-state solution.
Yeah.
So we have a problem, and it's going to be a long road until we be able to resolve this problem. And I think history showed that Muslims were really quite good dealing with Jews living in the Muslim world. And the example, look to what happened in Spain, for instance, during the Inquisition. the Jews left Spain to the Arab world and to the Muslim world, and they were very well treated. So,
Yeah. So I want to say something about when Obama in 2009, June 2009, went to Cairo. And to address the Muslim world. Yeah. I think in terms of, aside from the people that were handpicked by the Mubarak regime to listen to Obama speaking, you know, a lot, as regards the masses in the Arab world, his speech, Obama's speech, I think fell on deaf ears. And the reason why was from the beginning when he talked about we are not against the Muslims. We are, you know, against terrorism and all that, and we are also with Israel, yeah, strategic ally, etc., etc. And then after that, now let's talk about solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Well, I mean, how can you be impartial in terms of being an arbiter between the Palestinians and the Israelis when you are saying we are with the Israelis? I mean, so that's why it fell on deaf ears. And he was basically lecturing, quote unquote, the Muslim world in terms of what they should do and what they should not do. So he was, you know, telling them what needs to be done. So that fell on deaf ears. I mean, I watched the speech at that time. I was watching it live, and it was just horrible. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. And that shows in the Egyptian revolution. It showed in the Egyptian revolution that when, for instance, Mubarak put Omar Suleiman, who was the head of intelligence, you know, in Egypt, as his vice president, the masses were talking Mubarak and Suleiman, agents of the American, you know, agents of the Americans. But in Arabic, Mubarak and Suleiman, Umala al-American. Yani meaning that the masses did not believe what the Americans have been saying because of what they've done to them through Mubarak, one, and what they have done to the Palestinians. I mean, so that's, I think it's very important to
well, it is really, it is, if we look at Omar Suleiman dealing with the Israelis were very strong. He basically really did what the Israelis wanted him to do. And in fact, it is known that the Israelis wanted to persuade the Americans that Omar Suleiman is the man that should rule Egypt until the last minute. But the final word came from the streets in Cairo. Omar Suleiman would probably be more evil than Mubarak was. The government people in Egypt don't feel that when it comes to, especially when it comes to Palestinian problem, that they really are speaking on the behalf of the Palestinians. You have the blockade in Gaza, and the Egyptian government didn't lift a hand to even send some food. They did precisely what the Israelis told them to do. And this didn't fall on deaf eyes in Egypt. They knew that. People are not stupid.
And also what the Americans asked the Egyptians to do against the Palestinians,
of course,
in Gaza, which is collective punishment, which is a crime under international law. It's an international crime. So you were mentioning how the Americans gave the Egyptians under the Mubarak regime, what, $23 million or something, to build a wall of steel below ground to stop the infiltration of food and the rest of it into Gaza. I mean, so that is like what the United States has been doing in terms of collaborating, in terms of collective punishment.
It's really very difficult to tell the Americans that just look back at what you've been doing. And all what the evil things that happen in the Middle East, American had hand in it. It is just absurd that we think that the United States really has to take the side of Israel no matter what. Why? I just can't see why. Why the United States, the taxpayers, are paying per capita to the Israelis much, much more than what they are paying to the rest of the world. The world is poor. And the major chunk of the American aid goes to Israel.
Yeah, at least $3 billion. This
$3
is the
billion.
direct one. Yeah.
Direct one, which is fine. If you look at, for instance, you give Egypt with a population of 80 million, 1.5 billion, and this 1.5 billion is going to the military establishment, not really filtering down to the Egyptian people. These are the things that really, if we have good media, they should bring up these things, but they don't.
Yeah, they don't, because they are like instruments, more or less, of U.S. foreign policy. I want to go to another segment I did with Elton Daniel, because he was talking about how, in the previous segment, how the United States was clear in wanting Mubarak to resign, although there was an oscillation in their views, like now, resign in September or whenever, or in a few weeks, whatever. But anyway, Elton Daniel, in terms of reason why encouraging Mubarak to leave.
Well, it seems to me that right now what they're trying to do, I mean, the reason that they would be encouraging Mubarak to leave is that they're hoping if they act fast enough that they can bring in people that they consider reliable. It lets the revolutionary steam kind of blow off, and then you wind up with an amenable government that's not going to rock the boat too much. I think they're afraid if it gets dragged out over a long period of time, what will happen in Egypt will be what happened in Iran. You know, it goes on and on and on and becomes more and more difficult to control and more radicalized, and different groups come and the army begins to fall apart and all of these kinds of problems happen. You wind up with a much more problematic situation. And I think they're hoping that if they can get it to blow over quickly, that then things will settle back down to be acceptable. But Mubarak is not following that script.
Yeah, it's interesting that, Mubarak started doing things on his own, and for the first time he's talking, we don't want any foreign intervention in our policies, even though like he was taking, Egypt under Mubarak was a satellite of the United States,
Of course, and Israel.
Yeah, of course, yeah, and Israel, yeah. What I want to do is go back to Elton Daniel in one other segment, because he talks about the thugs on the fourth day of the revolution and what they did, and that is the responsibility of Mubarak. So we'll do that, and then we'll discuss.
Okay.
Mubarak tried to use these thugs to break up the demonstrations. It was really a slap in the face to Obama's face, slap in the face to Obama, because he had just asked him to do the opposite. So they're confused there. I mean, then you have these people who were also in the Fox News in particular trying to push the kind of version of events that's coming out of Israel, which is, these are not demonstrations, they're riots, and this is violence that needs to be contained, and we can't afford to have Mubarak swept away. We should prop him up. All of these, it's all, very familiar in terms of what happened in Iran. The same kind of debate about, do we be loyal to somebody who's been a faithful servant for 30 years, or do we just toss them out and we preserve the policies? They did the same thing with shuffling the cabinets, trying to find somebody that might be acceptable to the opposition. They oscillated back and forth between crackdowns and leniency, and it just spiraled out of control.
Yeah, so that, before we discuss this, there's someone on the air. Ahmed, on the air? Hello? No, we lost Ahmed. So could we?
Sure.
Sorry.
I would like to really comment on it. Often you see in the media now a comparison between what happened in Iran and what might happen in Egypt. It's not that relevant, because if you look at the history of Egypt, or I'm talking about the entire history, there wasn't a theological government, the Islamic government that ruled Egypt. There was Muslim rulers, but they never ruled by Islamic law or Sharia, the word that really terrifies people. We have more than 6,000 verses in the Quran. There are only 4 items that are, according to the Quran, that's punishable. One of them is to steal, the other is to have an adultery, the other 2 are just along the same line, and they are not insignificant. So the Quran really is not a Sharia's religion. In fact, if you compare this to Judaism, Judaism has lots of laws. Islam is different. Egypt was never ruled, and I don't think it will never be a theological government. We have Muslim rulers, yes, but we are not going to have any government that's ruled by Sharia, because this is ended during the Prophet time, and maybe 20 years at the most after the Prophet. After that, it was not a religion state.
Yeah, I think we have Ahmed on the line. You're on the air. Hello? I don't know what happened again, but anyway, we will re-establish contact apparently. Yeah. So anyway, that's good. The boogeyman, Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism,
right.
etc.
It's overplayed,
Yeah.
really.
And the boogeyman, not and beyond that, it becomes Islam as the
Right.
boogeyman, because
Right.
you know, in the West, a lot of Christians don't know what Christianity is talking about in the first place, so much less what Islam is talking about. And
Right.
I don't think too many people have read the Quran or have read something about the Quran by scholars of the Quran.
Right.
You know, so I think that's interesting. What I want to do now, since we lost Ahmed another time, to go to Faridi Farhi, and I asked her about the imperial project of the United States, of course, given the United States' interests in the region and so forth. So we'll go to Faridi.
That imperial project, it's become so internally contradictory and overtly blatant in terms of its contradictions that is no longer sustainable. So they have to make adjustments. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, you simply, it is one thing to have ideals that are great ideals like democracy, freedom, and so on, and continuously on a daily basis undermine those ideals in your practice, So United States government for the past 30, 40 years has been touting democracy and freedom, but supporting extreme authoritarian governments in the Middle East. That's one thing. It is another thing that in terms of your everyday practice, you are constantly engaged in contradictory action. Okay? So that's why I say, for example, the events in Iran in 2009 are so important in relationship to reaction today. So in 2009, people of Iran go and engage in protests in the streets, and the United States government comes and celebrates those protests because they are happening and they are occurring against a detractor, an opposing government. So you cannot promote people's protest one day, and then the next day when it happens in a country that is your friend, they say, I don't support it. I'm supporting stability is more important in this context. So you actually are seeing day-to-day contradiction in terms of practice that because of the nature of our world, and the reality of 24-hour television, the reality of alternative means of communication, for example, like Al Jazeera and blogosphere, you cannot maintain. One day I do this and the next day I do that. So if it is to maintain its imperialism, it has to rationalize and bring those governments at least partially or in terms of their appearances in line with the propagated ideals. And part of that has to do with the way that, for example, the United States has approached the question of democracy in the Middle East. So the reality is, okay, if you're going to go for democratic sentiments in the Middle East, well, the democratic sentiments may end up electing people that the United States government doesn't like. Now, the practice has been that the United States, on the one hand, has talked about elections, but then when elections happen and they don't like the results, like they did not do, like in Palestine, they actively engage in subversion of that elected government. Or they refuse to acknowledge the power equations within particular countries, like in Lebanon. Okay, Hezbollah is an important political force in the country. United States insists that it will not negotiate under any circumstance, not talk to Hezbollah. In fact, right before the events in Egypt, it made an argument that if Hezbollah takes control of the Lebanese government, it will not talk to the Lebanese government. Well, that kind of dynamic will not work anymore.
Yeah, actually, meaning that after these revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt and perhaps in other places, the U.S. has to readjust not only its foreign policy, but the way it deals with the region. But now I think Earth has established contact with Amand, who's on the line. So we have only about 8 minutes. Amand, are you on? Hello? She's not. Okay. So this is the last time we try to
I just
talk
want
with
to have
Amand.
a,
But
to
you
make
go ahead.
a comment, really. The United States have military bases and facilities in more than 100 countries in the world. We don't have the Cold War anymore. We have financial problems in this country. The educational system is suffering in this country. Business is leaving the United States, so the labor is suffering. Why don't we just cut some of our expenditure that's not, in my opinion, necessary, and focus on what we need to do in this country? I remember Rutherford Hayes, he was the president of the United States in about 1895 or something like that.
Hello?
He said,
Hello?
Hello? What? Did you find us?
Yes, this is again. We are having a hard time connecting.
Okay, so we have only a few minutes left, so if you can make your comment or question quick, we would appreciate that simply because of time.
Oh,
So
no problem.
go ahead.
I'm so happy for Egypt. I think every Arab American is really happy right now, whether they're Syrian or Egyptian or Lebanese.
Are you Arab American, by the way?
Yeah, I'm Syrian.
Oh, okay. You're in Hawaii too. Okay, you gotta get in touch with us anyway. Yeah. All right. Good. So that's good to know.
I'm just very happy for the Egyptian people because I studied in the American University of Cairo.
Oh,
But-
all right. Yeah. Nice university. Good university.
Yes, and just one comment. I think it's very important. You know, watching the Egyptian people today makes me realize that Arabs in America have to get involved with the government in America if they want to change.
Yeah.
If they want to change the foreign policy.
I agree with you. But the thing is that we have to get involved in a way that really makes a difference. So far, Arab Americans involved in terms of politics in the United States, it's only not for the sake of like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in terms of well, we should have more trade with Egypt or more trade with the United Arab Emirates or whatever. You know what I'm saying? They're pushing different agendas, say, than what might the other lobbies push. For instance, the APAC lobby, which is America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, they're dedicated to one thing, which is Israeli-American relations. You know, one country, Israel, and America, bring them together and support Israeli policies.
I understand that, and you know, before even Obama was elected, he had to talk to AIPAC and make them at ease. And so, as an American Arab, we have to become as strong as AIPAC if we want to see the policy, the foreign policy, change in the Middle East.
Yeah. Okay, but he's in the. I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to say that Obama basically has proved to be in the pocket of AIPAC when it comes to Israel, and he mentioned that also in 2009 June in the in his Cairo speech. So that's why I mentioned earlier that you know, his speech fell on deaf ears, except for those people who were handpicked by the Mubarak regime to listen to him and a few other leaders here and there in the Arab world. But these guys don't count, as we have seen in Tunisia and Cairo. But anyway, I want to say I'm sorry, I gotta move on because we only have about 4 minutes or something like that. And also Fikry, he would like to make another comment. So thank you very much, and try and get in touch with us at the UH at Ethnic Studies. All right, thank you.
I just want to add something to your reply, that Arab American are relatively newcomers here, and their population now is about 4 million. And we have an organization, several organizations. Most important is Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which is ADC. You could look it up, and I think it is doing good work for Arab American and for American at large. I just haven't finished what I was saying about Rutherford Hayes. He was a president almost more than 100 years ago, and he said, it's no longer the government of the people, by the people, for the people. It is the government of the corporation, by the corporation, for the corporation. And I think this is the challenge that is ahead of us all. I just don't understand why we have to spend so much money on military establishment. We have establishment in more than 100 countries, including, for instance, in Egypt, there is a big military establishment in the southern of the Red Sea, an area called Ras Binas. There is a strong American presence that's unofficially recognized by people. People don't know them, and they keep it hush, hush, hush. We need to cut all these expenditures to look at what the country really needs.
And why is it there? I mean, to protect Israel.
They used it in attacking Iraq, of course. Right. Egyptian people don't know that, and they wouldn't have supported that.
Right. Yeah. So we have basically a minute, so we should be wrapping things up. Do you have other comments as regards, for instance, to why people are afraid of the Muslim Brothers? I mean, you talked about it, but and that you know, we're afraid that there'll be a political vacuum in Egypt, and then the Muslim Brothers, like in some kind of somersault, would jump into the to fill out that vacuum. Yeah.
I don't really think so. I think I always felt that the Muslim Brotherhood was overrated. What happened in Egypt now, the Muslim Brotherhood really had nothing to do with it. They participated in it late in the game. They were objecting to even joining the demonstration. I think democracy is a solution to limit the problem with Muslim fundamentalism.
Yeah. Well, we gotta wrap it up, and thank you very much for watching. See you next month, March. And thank you, Fikry, for coming and sharing with us. And we wish you a good and safe trip to Cairo, and keep in touch from there and tell us what's happening.
We'll do that.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good night, and see you.